Hello and welcome to a special interview with the well-known politician and author Shashi Tharoor. The Padmavati controversy has raised critical questions about India's commitment to freedom of speech and our politicians' commitment to the principles of our constitution. Those are two of the issues I shall raise today with Shashi Tharoor. Mr. Tharoor, before I come to the details of the Padmavati controversy, let me put to you a question of principle. In a democracy, does freedom of speech, freedom of expression, entitle a film director to portray historical figures and historical events as he imaginatively and creatively wants? Or is he required and expected to stick to the majoritarian, traditional, conventional view?
Well, I think no one can be obliged to stick to anybody else's view, but there is one challenge in discussing freedom of speech in our country, which is that we actually have, unlike Western democracies, we have the provision of Article 19(2) that specifically imposes reasonable restrictions in the interests of various things, including public order, decency, morality, relations with foreign states, and all these things. So there is, in fact, an explicit principle in the Constitution that says you have freedom of speech, but it's not absolute. And then drawing the line each time is the big challenge.
So my question is this: when a director, and I'm talking of any director, not just Sanjay Leela Bhansali, wishes to make a film of a character, historical or otherwise, has he got the right to do it imaginatively and creatively, or does he have to stick to facts that are given and accepted?
He has the right, but then he has to also ask in his own interest what are the consequences. There are lots of films in the last 70 years about historical personalities and characters. I mean, lots, in the hundreds, in multiple Indian languages. And most of them have been screened without any problem, but that's largely because they've been hagiographical. They have essentially tended to glamorize the person being depicted, and his admirers will go and watch it.
The danger comes when you're critical.
The danger comes when you're either critical or when you are taking what the followers of the person you're depicting consider to be liberties with the historical record. At that point, you become exposed not so much to, I think, legal restrictions on your freedom of speech as the practical restrictions created by the anger of the mob. Because what you're seeing essentially is that if you make a film and a state government bans it because they think there's going to be a riot, or a film theatre owner refuses to show it because he thinks his theatre will be burned down, as has nearly happened to a theatre that showed a trailer of Padmavati, then it becomes in any case something that makes you question whether you've done the right thing in terms of your own interests.
You began that answer very interestingly. You said that the restriction that the filmmaker has to consider is the possible consequences to himself, which suggests that you're free to interpret historical characters, but bear in mind that there could be consequences for you, so you might be advised to self-censor.
Well, I don't like the word self-censor, but I think basically what it comes down to is you will have to ask yourself, if I publish this book, if I make this film, if I put on this play, if I read this poem, what are the likely consequences in India for me if I so do?
And if I don't like them and don't want them, then I need to change my film or change my book.
Or my script,
or
whatever, or not do it.
Fear of the consequences is what restrains you. Isn't this the point at which the government is expected constitutionally, and as the Supreme Court has repeatedly said, to step in? It's the government's duty to ensure that these consequences that you fear, the riots that you fear, the hate that you fear, won't happen. And therefore, should you be self-censoring, or should you be relying on the government to fulfill its constitutional duty?
Look, to my mind, obviously, I would like the government to shore up the principle and practice of freedom of expression by supporting artistic and creative freedom everywhere.
But it doesn't.
But the problem is the government is simultaneously the upholder of the constitutional principle of freedom of speech and the upholder of law and order. And in the latter capacity, it often finds itself taking decisions which undermine the former. It's troubled me a great deal. For example,
often criticizes the government when it gets the balance wrong. You seem to be suggesting that it's almost understandable.
Well, as somebody who's been in government and privy to some of the conversations and arguments that take place, I am beginning to have some sympathy with the view that we can't, unfortunately, have a completely absolutist view of freedom of
So
speech.
you have some sympathy for the view that maybe when the government has to handle this balance between law and order on the one side and upholding freedom of speech on the other, it might err on the side of maintaining law and order and curb a little bit of free speech in the process.
Depending on what the issue is. You see, for me, it will unfortunately have to be, we'd all love to have an absolute principle that applies across the board. As a writer, that's what I want. But in practice, I suspect we're going to find ourselves constantly drawing the line each time on a case-by-case basis.
Has the politician got the better of the author in Shashi Tharoor?
In this particular instance, I'm just trying to be a realist. Forget the politician, forget the author. As an author, by the way, I've staked a position, a very strong position, not just as an author, even as a United Nations official, in favor of freedom of speech. I've stood up for it in unpopular environments.
You're not doing it now. Now you're more understanding of the government and the need for law and order and the possibility that as a result you have to curb some measure of free speech.
Karan, it's very easy for me to sit here and say, the author's freedom, the filmmaker's freedom is unconditional and cannot be trammeled. It's easy for me to say that. If you then tell me, why am I different from anybody else who's making this argument? Well, one difference I have is I am somebody who is in public life, who seeks elective office and may one day be called upon to express an institutional governmental view.
So you also have to be careful about the impact of free speech on people who are your potential voters, and if they turn against you, you lose an election. And what's more important to you, winning the election or upholding free speech? And you seem to be suggesting winning the election is more important.
No, I suggest, well, if people like me win the election, we will uphold free speech. So it's not a bad thing in any case.
Well, I'm not sure whether people like you will uphold free speech, because people like you were just now suggesting that perhaps the balance should err on the side of law and order. But let
me explain this. It's the
I think the Supreme Court has to be dragging you into further and further difficulties rather than clarity.
That's because the Supreme Court has an expression about the spark in the powder keg. And I, in a different speech, have used the analogy of a lighted match in a petrol pump. But basically, this is what it boils down to. Everybody should have the right to light his match. But when he lights his match and blows up the petrol pump, destroying every car in it and taking a few lives, is his right to light the match more important? Ultimately, that line is being drawn every day by responsible governments and sometimes by the court.
Right.
So you're looking at a situation in which Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in America said, right, no one has a right to falsely shout fire in a crowded theatre, because obviously the consequences of that, the stampede, the destruction, perhaps loss of life, outweighs his right to free speech. So in every society, you draw the line somewhere. In the Western world, in America today, no editor would use the N word for a black person. Not because it's against the law, he doesn't have absolute free speech.
It's just not acceptable anymore.
It's not acceptable behavior. So all of these considerations, everyone has to be attentive to the wider society around them.
Okay.
Just as a woman taking off a bikini top in Copacabana or Saint-Tropez wouldn't be able to do so in Dubai or Karachi or Bombay for that matter. Similarly, freedom of speech too will have to take into account the society we're in.
I'll grant you one thing. You've almost dug yourself out of the hole you quite happily fell into a moment ago. But I'll put one more point to you before I change subjects and move on. I'm not sure a film or an author's book can be compared to lighting a match. And certainly, I'm not sure that you should look upon the audience as a set of powder kegs or petrol pumps that are ready to go off. But leave that aside.
No, but let me answer this too, because this is the very important question. As a nationalist, amateur historian, I was extremely irritated and offended by the colonial laws on sedition, on restricting free speech and so on, which were premised on the assumption, to use Macaulay's actual words, that Indians were an emotional people prone to taking offense, likely to overreact.
That is pretty close to the explanation that underlies your belief that you err on the side of law and order rather than free speech. It's because we are prone emotionally to overreact. You're saying, let's be careful, let's not bring a match near this potential powder keg.
There have been instances.
Okay.
I can tell you there was a story, for example, published by a Bangalore newspaper about 20 years ago.
Muhammad the Idiot,
which was actually not about the Prophet at all, but about a mentally handicapped child.
So what you're saying actually, forgive me, is that but what you're really saying, even though you're not putting it so bluntly, is that the Indian people are not mature enough emotionally or intellectually to handle free speech. And because they react wrongly, and that creates a law and order problem, we have to actually curb free speech rather than change the attitude of the Indian people. It's the free speech that you're curbing, not the attitude of the people that you're changing.
No, that is not fair. Because as far as I'm concerned, I would much rather change the attitude of the Indian people, whether to the paintings of Hussain,
but you
Bhansali,
began by suggesting that the balance has to be on the side of law and order. That doesn't suggest you're changing the attitude of the people. You're curbing the easy thing, which is free speech.
I'm saying it's not about what is the easy thing or even the more desirable thing. Clearly the more desirable thing for anyone ought to be to preserve creative freedom of expression, artistic freedom and so on, and not encourage or condone acts of violence that are threatened to be perpetrated by mobs. Okay. Obviously, nobody, certainly not me, shows greater sympathy to the mobs than to the freedom of the artist. I'm just saying if the government of the day says, we may not agree with the mobs, but we believe they will go berserk, therefore we believe we want to remove the provocation for them to go berserk, that is a government decision that governments in India have made and will make.
That particular explanation or description of the government decision actually flies in the face of what the Supreme Court has frequently ruled, most recently actually when they were asked to delay the release of Padmavati themselves, and they said it is the duty of governments to provide security, to ensure law and order is maintained, and the fear and threat that it may not be maintained is not sufficient to ban free speech. You're actually suggesting that fear, that threat could be sufficient, and bearing in mind the fact that governments are either bad at controlling or unable to control or don't even want to control, it's easier to ban free speech. But let's move beyond principle. Let's move beyond principle to the actual details of this particular story, the Padmavati story. In this instance, is it justified for politicians or for civil society groups to call for the ban of a film or extensive changes in the film, which A, they haven't seen, and B, they don't even have an accurate idea of the content of. And it's entirely based, their call for a ban, on their fear or their apprehension of what the film will do or say.
No, this is why it's so unreasonable, and I think everybody who has any basic sense on this matter would have to say somebody should watch the thing, and the Central Board of Film Censors is the body empowered to watch it and judge whether it's suitable for public distribution.
So without watching, a call for a ban is unjustified?
Totally unjustified and unreasonable.
Then let me go to step 2. In the present circumstances, at least 4 state governments, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan and Gujarat, have decided that the film will not be screened. One of those governments, possibly 2, have said even if it gets a CBFC certificate, it still won't be screened. But these governments haven't seen the film, and they're well aware that the film hasn't been released. Now, in their circumstances, are they justified in saying the film won't be screened? Because, to cite the principle you were talking, they're scared about a potential law and order problem. They don't want to incite people they can't control. Therefore, it's wiser and sensible to say the film won't be screened. You won't bring the lit match to the powder keg. Or is their decision not to screen it a flagrant violation of democratic principles? Which of the two?
Oh, it's definitely the latter. I don't think they should or can make such a decision without actually seeing the film and making an independent professional judgment as to whether it might indeed light a powder keg. So the
principle we talked about earlier doesn't apply until you've seen the film?
Well, naturally, you have to know what it is that's going to ignite the powder keg, right?
You can't do it on apprehension, suspicion, anecdote or fear.
Well, you know, the famous example of all of this is the Satanic Verses controversy. I took the Rushdie side on that particular incident. I was not in the party or in politics.
That, unfortunately, is an example that works against the Congress party's claim to be a liberal party. I'll come to that in a moment's time. I'm just pointing out for the audience, it was Rajiv Gandhi who banned it without reading it and before the book had even been imported into India.
You know, as you know, Mr. Shahabuddin had read it, had decided to denounce it, had gone to Rajiv Gandhi and said that...
It was actually Khushwant Singh who had in fact done it and had advised the publishers as their advisor that the book should not be brought to India. But leave that aside. I'll come to that in a moment's time.
There was Mr. Shahabuddin's...
I'll come to that in a moment's time. Let's stick for a moment to Padmavati. You made it clear that it is unjustified for governments to use the principle that fear of law and order could somehow in some circumstances justify a ban. If you haven't even seen the movie, until you see the movie, that principle doesn't apply. Let's come to the third detail about Padmavati. Practically every single credible historian of medieval India, from Harbans Mukhya onwards, who's the doyen of them, has argued that Padmavati is not a real historic creature. To quote Mukhya, no such person, he says, ever lived in flesh and blood. In fact, the Padmavati story flows out of a 16th century Sufi poem by a Muslim poet Jayasi. So Padmavati is either a literary character, cultural myth, but not historic reality. Now, do you, Shashi Tharoor, accept she's not historic reality, or would you say in the conditions and circumstances of India, Rajput tradition and belief has to take precedence over formal history? Which of the two?
Well, you see, what I believe is actually irrelevant here, because ultimately accuracy is not the point, it's perception. And therefore what it boils down to is when various people claim that this was a real story, that the person actually existed, and indeed one figure claims to be descended from her and is making some of the loudest
the head of the
noises on
Karni
this.
Sena.
Exactly. Clearly, at some point, myth and fact have intermingled to a point which is beyond our ability to separate
But the codicil
them.
of what you're saying is that once they've intermingled to the point you can't separate them, then in fact, in all truth, myth or Rajput belief and tradition takes precedence, because Rajput myth or Rajput tradition equates with history. So it takes precedence.
The inflammation of sentiment is what's at issue, not whether it's historically accurate or not. I mean, I too know that there were historians who accompanied Alauddin Khilji in his attack on Chittor, and that they have not mentioned any such incident or person in any of their accounts. And that Jayasi, Malik Muhammad Jayasi, wrote about 260 years after the attack.
224.
And what is even more interesting is that it is speculated that he chose the attack on Chittor for his metaphor because Chit, as in the idea of Man, because the principal personages of his story were actually metaphors for the body, the soul and the mind.
Absolutely.
And all of this has been suggested as very, very much in the Persian Sufi tradition.
But this is why I asked you the question, since you're so well aware of the
But
background.
my point is, it doesn't matter. Just as
If it doesn't matter, then cultural myth takes precedence over historical fact.
It can if people are so attached to them that they're going to be inflamed and angry and even violent about them, then very clearly we are touching somebody to the quick, and we have to look at whether in so doing we are doing something that is
This takes
reasonable.
me back to something you suggested pretty forcefully when we were at the stage of talking about the principle, where you suggested that the Indian people may not be intellectually mature or emotionally mature enough to accept criticism of something which is a myth, but which they take as fact. A comparison to that is the way Western societies reacted to the last temptation of Christ. It clearly offended those who believe Christ is a real historic figure. It was probably offensive to many Christians, even emotionally, leave aside historically. But it was permitted, it wasn't banned, no changes were made. The film was criticized, but it was seen. We're not at that point in India, you're saying. Even though
in fact, the
we
Indian
claim
Christian
to be a
community-
democracy, we're not mature enough to handle the consequences of free speech when it affects something that's emotionally close to us.
The Indian Christian community had the film banned in India. The very film you're talking about, based on Kazanzaki's book. So the fact is that that in India, sensitivities do seem to rise to the surface in ways that they don't quite in the West. And as I said, constitutionally, we have restrictions in our constitution that they don't have in the West. In the West, as you know, the American Civil Liberties Union actually defended as an exercise of free speech Nazis walking through a Jewish neighborhood spewing slogans of hate, because their right to spew those slogans was something that the ACLU felt should be defended in absolute terms. In India, you cannot do that.
But
I'm
going to pluck out something from your reasoning that's very important, because I think it's germane to the point we're making. The sensitivities of the Indian people on cultural, religious, emotional issues are so strong and can be so easily inflamed that you have to bear them in mind when you look at the extent to which you can fulfill constitutional rights of free speech. And those rights of free speech have to be tempered by your awareness of these sensitivities. This is one real sense in which we're a democracy, but different to Western democracies, because there these sensitivities wouldn't temper free speech. In India, they have to, because you're saying the consequence is something governments can't handle. The Supreme Court has often ruled they should and must, But you're saying in reality, governments can't handle it. The tempering is more important than running the risk.
Not to mention the fact that the Constitution gives them the right to impose reasonable restrictions, and the Supreme Court then decides whether it's reasonable or not.
Well, the Supreme Court has repeatedly said that
they've
the
had a more liberal, thank God,
are not reasonable. Let's come back to Padmavati. There's a fourth example or fourth detail I want to put to you. Recently, the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh has begun to refer to Padmavati as Rashtra-Mata. Do you accept that Padmavati is the mother of the nation?
She's not my Rashtra-Mata, but perhaps there are some Rajputs in Rajasthan who feel that way. Look, I've been to Chittor. I admire a lot of the history, and I have great admiration for the valor of the Rajput people and all they've fought, and it's terrific. But this mythologizing of events to a point where ultimately any criticism is impossible to make is genuinely troubling. And it's not even criticism. No one's actually, as I understand it, at any stage criticizing any of the individuals concerned. They seem to have merely given them a certain fictional personage qualities and behaviors
which is deemed
that
to
are
be
seen
offensive.
as sacrilegious. Exactly.
But do you know what you're
But
suggesting?
I do remember, for example,
can I stop you there? Can I point out to you what you're suggesting? Because it would have occurred to the audience by now, and that's why I want to point it out explicitly to you. You're saying intellectually and emotionally, we the Indian people are not ready to be fully democratic. Intellectually and emotionally, we are not ready to handle free speech because the consequences of free speech, which is that you have to accept the offense it gives, we aren't prepared for. You're saying that even if you haven't put it in so many words.
No, I think that's going farther than I'd be prepared to go. All I'm
You may
saying
not be prepared to go, but that's what you've actually said by implication.
No, what I'm saying, Karan, is this. I believe that in our country, obviously, freedom of speech is an ideal. It's something I've stood up for internationally, I've stood up for in this country, and I will continue to stand up for. Number two, in exercising the freedom of speech, there are consequences which have to be borne in mind. And sometimes, as we saw with the case of Perumal Murugan, who decided to censor himself for a couple of years, the lessons drawn from those consequences by the artists themselves are far more damaging for the principle of freedom of expression than anything that people may have done.
Now you seem to be arguing against the principle you adumbrated 10 minutes ago.
I'm just telling you that this is the way in which this issue is playing out in our country. Number three, governments have a responsibility to maintain peace in our society, to take various points of view into account, to balance things, and indeed political parties, as you rightly said, have to win elections. So they, in turn, have a set of considerations in which the passionately expressed views of people who claim to be offended inevitably feature. You and I may not like the fact. I've often said in the past, if you're offended, don't watch the movie, don't read the book, change the channel, but don't make your offense something that affects my right to watch it.
Can I interrupt? There are two contradictory strains of logic in that answer. First, you began by talking about how Perumal Murugan had ended up, as a result of being censored, censoring himself. And that has, you said, damaging consequences for free speech and undesirable and probably unintended. And that suggests, that line of logic, that someone like Perumal Murugan should never have been censored, because you don't want a censored book to lead to an author censoring himself, and therefore creativity and imaginative writing ending because people are too scared to write. That's one strain of logic in your answer. The second strain of logic was right at the end, where you talked about how governments have to be well aware of the fact that if you don't handle situations, you'll have a law and order problem, and that is something governments can't control, and particularly when people get inflamed so easily, you will have violence and death. And that logic suggests that maybe regardless of the consequences of creativity and imagination as a result of censorship, the bigger interest is the interest of maintaining peace. The two lines of argument are in conflict with each other.
But don't you see, this is the big problem with actually running a country, is that governance involves making impossible choices
and
like
this is why I said to you, in a very real sense,
on a case-by-case basis.
But this is why I said to you, in a very real sense, you're suggesting, without putting it so explicitly, that India and the Indian people are not fit and right or adult enough, whatever adjective you want to use, for democracy.
No,
we are democratic in the sense we vote and change governments. We're not democratic in the sense that we accept that free speech means you tolerate the offense it gives. That we won't accept. That's where, unfortunately, I'm going to use this provocative word, we're democratic pygmies, not adults.
See, Karan, our society is a large and complex one. You and I are having this conversation here. You and I perfectly, I hope reasonably, can say that we will not be objecting to even things that offend us because we understand that democratic principle. But we're living in a society in which not everybody buys into either that value or has that behavioral instinct.
So let me then put an example to you. And I'm going to go back to the point you raised about satanic verses. That was a decision taken by a man just like you and me. English speaking, westernized, Oxbridge educated, in every sense
me.
like us. Rajiv Gandhi.
Yeah, I'm saying I wasn't.
He decided to ban a book he hadn't read. He decided to ban a book that hadn't been brought into India. He therefore clearly went against his natural instincts. Is that entirely justified by the fact that he had this fear, which hadn't even been tested? It was just an apprehension that the book, if it comes to India and is read, would lead to communal violence. It will offend the Muslim community so strongly that you'd have a law and order problem. Was it justified to do it before there'd even been a spark lit? He imagined the spark and then took the action.
At the time, I thought not. Subsequently, I have to believe that, unfortunately, he was right. First of all, he did, in fact, have a representation from Sahaj Shahabuddin, who'd gone public as well, saying that this is something so profoundly offensive and unthinkable to the Muslim community that the entry of that book into India would indeed result in demonstrations.
This is probably the only occasion on which Rajiv Gandhi listened to Shahabuddin. On every other, he wouldn't have.
He wouldn't have. But he was vindicated by what happened in Pakistan a week or 10 days later, when there was a demonstration in which there were deaths about this particular book at that time. So if Rajiv Gandhi hadn't taken the preemptive action he did, we might have had the 7 or 10 people who were killed in Pakistan the following week dying in India instead. So the argument is, he essentially chose between two lousy options. He chose the lesser evil. And that is ultimately the kind of decision that governments have to make all the time. By the way, I actually heard this from an Indian Muslim civil servant at the time, who had, like me, been to St. Stephen's College, was a very sophisticated westernized individual who accepted the principle of free speech, had admired Rushdie's earlier books, but said, as an IAS officer, I don't think that Rajiv Gandhi could have done anything differently.
In this case, your argument rests on the claim that Rajiv Gandhi had two lousy choices and he took the lesser of them, the less lousy of them. Let's come to two other examples. Once again, I'm deliberately choosing examples that pertain to Congress governments. In 2012, the Jaipur Literary Festival had invited Salman Rushdie. The Rajasthan government, which was controlled by the Congress party, first advised him not to come and then went further and said, we advise you also not to do it by video link. As a result of which, he had to give an interview to NDTV outside the premises of the festival. Now, was that justified in 2012?
No, I thought it was disgraceful, and I actually criticized the organizers of the festival at that time to their face for having caved in.
Would you have also criticized the Rajasthan government, which was a Congress government? It was Gehlot, now General Secretary of your party. Would you have criticized him?
As I said, he took the decision that he felt was necessary to take. The Chief Minister of Gujarat. But the organizers, I felt, should not have caved in on the video conference link. But in any case, I think the police came and sat on them and said, there's going to be violence here, there are tens of thousands of people coming in, you've got no control.
You know, you're accusing the organizers of caving in over the video violence link. I'm going to quote you what Ram Pratap Singh, the owner of Diggi Palace, said to the papers. I have taken a decision not to allow the video link to take place on the advice of the Rajasthan police, who come under the Rajasthan government. And let me tell you, when the police advise, they're virtually telling you no, full stop. So
the same thing happened, by the way, the
it's
Calcutta
not the
Book
organizers
Fair.
Who caved in.
Same thing happened with the
your
Calcutta Book Fair.
Congress-controlled government that put pressure. So you are critical of that. Here, it wasn't choosing between two lousy choices. Here, they simply took the wrong decision. Would you accept?
No. Again, they had to make the same calculation that Rajiv Gandhi was making. They probably said they would be violent.
Salman Rushdie had been to India earlier to win a Commonwealth Award.
I think in that particular instance, it could have been done differently. It's not that...
the same result, but handled more discreetly.
No.
So it's the presentation,
for example,
not the result.
There could definitely have been a video conference event if he was not able to physically come. I mean, frankly...
That wasn't permitted by your government.
Well, I don't approve of that. I mean, I think it was wrong.
So you are critical of that?
Yeah.
Let me come to the third example. In 2008...
Oh, by the way, the same thing happened at the Calcutta Book Fair a few months later, because I was invited to that too. And again, the same thing happened. The police said that it was not safe for him to come to Calcutta.
In 2008, Maqbool Fida Hussain, who had left India, openly said to the New York Times, and I think it was the 8th of November 2008, that he left India because he didn't have confidence the Congress government of the day, Dr. Manmohan Singh's government, where you were a minister.
Well, I wasn't in 2008. I was far away from India or from public life and politics.
But Dr. Manmohan Singh's
was a
government
friend of mine, so I didn't know.
Would not protect him. Publicly, he said to the New York Times.
Well, I actually had many conversations in person with Mr. Hussain at that time, and what he said to me was not about the government's failure to protect him. It was that however much protection he was given by the government, he said the amount of harassment he would face from multiple court cases, many of which were framed on non-bailable grounds, would mean that he would be arrested the moment he stepped off the plane to face charges in those cases, and he couldn't abide that
Except
idea.
To the New York Times, he clearly said, and I'm quoting the date, 8th of November 2008, he left because he believed the Congress, which means the government, because Congress was government, would not protect him.
As I said, all I can tell you is because I had so many conversations with him about this, he did not say this to me. He said, because I can tell you, for example, the state government of Kerala wanted to give him an award and said, we will give you all protection and we will actually offer you immunity against arrest when you're on our soil. We will instruct our police not to arrest you even if there is a non-bailable warrant against you.
Well, if he doesn't trust the Congress government at the center to protect him, he's not going to trust a state government to protect him. So that follows.
No, but I'm just saying, I think he was really so intimidated by the number of cases against him that had much more to do with anything else. That he didn't feel at that point that he could come in normal peaceful circumstances.
You're saying therefore
he too was evaluating the consequences of his free speech.
You're saying his inability to trust that Congress would protect him is secondary to the harassment he would have faced because of the cases. That's possible, but the point I'm making is that he publicly
I'm dead as a writer, because he felt that the people he had to live amongst in the society, in the village, in the area he was living, had behaved so badly towards him, were ostracizing him, or protesting.
And it's very interesting
that he didn't want to live with those consequences.
At that time, other than P. Chidambaram, no one in Congress spoke out in defense of Perumal Murugan. But maybe in writing as an individual, your party officially from its platforms, your spokesman, more importantly, your leaders, Sonia and Rahul, were silent. And that's the point I want to end with. Today, you've given us a full explanation about the importance of maintaining law and order and how at times this means that freedom of speech has to be curbed, even if done so reluctantly. But the Padmavati issue has become a sort of litmus test at the moment of India's commitment to freedom of speech and a litmus test of politicians' ability or courage or strength to stand up and defend freedom of speech. And at this moment, when everyone is criticizing BJP politicians and chief ministers, not a word has been said by any leading congressperson in defense of Sanjay Leela Bhansali's right to make whatever film he wants to make of Padmavati, who is essentially, by the way, not even a historical character. She's a bit of poetic fiction. Rahul and Sonia Gandhi don't hesitate to criticize the government on GST and demonetization.
And
but
so
here, when there's a need to stand up and defend rights and freedoms, to prove you're really liberal and better and different, they're silent. They are just as concerned about losing votes, they're just as concerned about offending Rajputs as the BJP. On this issue, Congress is no better.
What kind of political party would not be concerned about votes, Karan? There's an election going on that is being fought, and I think clearly they will express their views. I have expressed my views. I am a congressman, and I've expressed my views on the show.
But there's silence from your party president or the one who's going to become president in a couple of weeks' time. Neither of them have thought it fit to stand up and voice support for the most fundamental right in a democracy, freedom of speech. Utter silence. Utter silence.
I think we've had other things to say in the electoral context.
Other things to do, other things to worry about. Let's not offend the Gujaratis in case things slide out of control there. Let's not worry about the impact on Himachal. But on freedom of speech, total silence.
I think that when it comes to concrete actions to defend freedom of speech, you'll find the Congress leadership much closer to your heart.
By then the film will be dead and the author who we want to defend forgotten.
Oh, I wouldn't say that.
You'll be greatly supportive because you put flowers on the grave of the film and memorialize the director. But while he's alive and there's a possibility, you're silent.
I'm telling you, I believe this film, that he has a right to make the film that he's made, that the film should be screened and viewed before any decision is made as to whether it might inflame opinion. and that the censor board is the right institution to do that, with all respect for everyone's sensitivities. And of course, every state government has then the right to decide
Shashi,
what they want to do.
if Sonia and Rahul had said what you've just said, the country would have been grateful to them. Let's, for the sake of pleasing you, pretend you're their voice and you're expressing their thoughts. They haven't got the courage. They haven't got the courage, but you've had the forthrightness to say
that's not fair, Karan. They have all the courage in the world, but people may decide what subjects they want to address, at what occasion, in what context.
That's usually the excuse a coward gives. I'll decide what I want to say, when to say it, and I'll say it quietly in my bathroom, but I won't say it in public. But anyway,
come on.
I don't mean to be offensive.
You
a pleasure talking to you.
You have been. I shall now conduct a demonstration against you.